Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode. We're going to be tackling a big topic that has to do with population movement, but more specifically, what happens to a place when the people who've lived there for decades or centuries leave, and then other people come in, and what does that mean for that place? If we want to get metaphysical, what happens to the soul of that place? Is there any continuity in a place when the people who live there are no longer there? Specifically, I'm answering a question from listener Melissa, who asks me about the history behind the city or city-state of Danzig, which is in today's Poland, before, during, and after World War II. If you're an aficionado of World War II, you probably know about Danzig because it was a major point of contention for Nazi Germany. It had a German population, but was not part of Germany due to World War I's Treaty of Versailles. And the German army mobilized and quickly captured Danzig and was one of the early goals in the war aims of the Nazi government. But I'm not going to get into all that stuff. I'm not going to go through a traditional narrative about Danzig and the role it played in World War II. Instead, I'm going to describe the German population of Danzig and why there were populations of Germans outside of Germany and had been for several centuries, what happened in this change where the German population left or was expelled or killed and replaced by Polish people, and what that meant to the city. Now, why I think this is an interesting question is because we're seeing something happening in Europe that happened a lot in Europe in the past and happened a lot in other parts of the world and still happen today, but really doesn't happen all that much in the West for the last 1,000 years. And what I mean by that is the mass movement of populations. Now, mass movements of populations happen a lot in the ancient world. You would have invasions of semi-nomadic people, the Scythians that the Persians had to deal with all the time, the Aramaeans that the Babylonian Empire had to deal with. If you were an empire in the ancient world, a great way to defend your borders is to conquer a land and then forcibly deport its people and force them to settle along your border so they're kind of cannon fodder for any invaders who would come about. The Old Testament speaks about the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities, where the Israelites are said to have been captured by these empires and forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands. Other examples of population movements happened in the Roman Empire. In the final century of the Western Roman Empire, Attila the Hun invades, the Goths invade, the Visigoths invade. And within a very short period of time, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that didn't live there before now live in these lands. With our growing databases of DNA and genetic information, we're able to trace population movement in a way we never able were to before. So there's a lot of exciting developments happening in tracking these demographic changes. Well, what happens in the West is that by about 1000 or so, a lot of these massive population movements mostly come to an end. Viking invasions slow down on the northern coast of Europe. Semi-nomadic people aren't breaking into Europe and drastically changing the makeup of the city. One of the last big population movements was the arrival of the Magyars, the ancestors of the Hungarians, over the Carpathian Mountains in 896, but these big arrivals don't really happen as much. Yes, the Mongols invade in the 1200s, but they don't really stay in Europe. They just take their captives and then return back to Central Asia. But mass population movements are still happening in other parts of the world. When I lived in Turkey, I was friends with many people whose family had ancestrally lived in one place for a very long period of time, but then 3 or 4 or 5 generations ago were uprooted and forced to move elsewhere. The nation of Turkey is full of people who identify as ethnically Turkish, and if you go back 100 years ago, there were ethnically Turkish people who lived in many places and they don't really live there now. There were ethnically Turkish people in the Balkans, in modern-day Bulgaria or Macedonia or Greece. There were people in the Caucasus regions, in modern-day Armenia or Georgia or Azerbaijan. There were ethnically Turkish people in the Crimea, in modern-day Ukraine. But due to independence movements in the Balkans and the Caucasus and Russia, many of these ethnically Turkish people were forced to leave, or deported, or exiled, and they came to Turkey. There are villages in modern-day Turkey where there was not a village 100 years ago, and they were settled by these people, by these refugees, by these immigrants. So Turkey became a nation of immigrants. And I found out about this historical fact not by reading a lot, but I would ask people where they were from. And in Turkey, when you ask someone, where are you from? It's a much different question in the Turkish language than it is in English. In English, where are you from in the American or European context mostly means, where were you born? Where did you grow up? In Turkey, where are you from can mean, what is the ancestral homeland of your father or your grandfather? When I was an English teacher in Istanbul, I'd ask my students, where are you from, just for simple speaking practice, and they would say, oh, I'm from Bursa, which is a city a few hours away from Istanbul. I'd say, oh, okay, you're from Bursa. When did you come to Istanbul? Oh, I was born in Istanbul. And I would say, wait, you said you were from Bursa, but you were born in Istanbul, so you're not from Bursa. They'd say, well, my grandfather grew up in Bursa, or my father did. At first, I thought that they weren't understanding the question. They were understanding the question, but they were answering it according to how they understood it, not how somebody from America would understand it. So that means is that they had a long memory of their family's connection to this particular city, even though they weren't necessarily born there. Another person might say they were from Bulgaria or Macedonia, but happened to be born in Istanbul. And we see this mentality of having ancestral connection to land, but in the most recent 1 or 2 or 3 generations, they've been moved away from their homeland in the Israeli-Palestinian debate. Many people who lived in Palestine in 1948 and left their home during the Israeli War of Independence believe that they are ancestrally entitled to their homeland. Many older ethnic Palestinians who live in Jordan, who live in the Middle East, or even the United States or Europe, will carry around a key that is a key to their old home in Palestine and hope that they or their descendants can one day return to this land and symbolically open the door again and return to it. So the point of this long preamble is that this feeling of connection to a land, even though you're no longer there, is something that's alive and well in certain parts of the world, especially the Middle East, where there have been population movements that have happened very recently in Turkey, with Jewish populations that used to be numerous in northern Iraq or Thessalonica, but are no longer there. Greeks who used to live in Izmir, or Smyrna as they called it, and are no longer there. They've been gone for generations, but they still feel connection to this land. This isn't the case as much in Europe, but perhaps we can make an example of this with Danzig. So this is what I'm going to look at in this episode. Danzig, for a lot of people who are interested in history, evokes images of Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland. You have waves of German infantry pouring into Poland, the Luftwaffe doing dive bombs, and panzer divisions streaking across the Polish plain. With the invasion of Poland, Germany's blitzkrieg warfare was put on frightening display, and it showed how poor Poland's outmoded defenses was to stop this invasion. The first shots of World War II were fired at a target that wasn't very strategic, but very symbolic. And that was Danzig. It was an ethnically German city that was northwest of Warsaw on the Baltic Sea coast that had been part of Germany, or the German Empire, from the early 1800s until the end of World War I. Hitler's interest in Danzig was a central part of the Nazi ideology, which called for the unification of all German people and reclaiming what he thought to be ancestral German lands. Danzig was no longer under German control after World War I and was established as the Free City of Danzig under the League of Nations authority. Germany lost other lands of Posen and West Prussian provinces that had been ceded to the reconstituted nation of Poland. So Danzig and the so-called Polish Corridor ensured Poland's access to the Baltic Sea, but it separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Many Germans were embittered by their defeat in World War I and thought the Treaty of Versailles had treated them unfairly and had to cede territory that was, by historical tradition, theirs. William Scheer wrote in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, to Germans, the most heinous crime of the Versailles peacemakers had been to separate East Prussia from the Reich by the Polish corridor, to detach Danzig, and to give to the Poles the province of Posen. Hitler thought that this condition was only temporary. And throughout the 1930s, he called for Danzig to be reunited with Germany. And he wanted German-controlled transportation lines to be built across the corridor to connect East Prussia with the rest of Germany. He told Polish Foreign Minister Joseph Beck in 1939, Danzig was German, would always remain German, and sooner or later return to Germany. Poland rejected these demands, of course. And once Hitler was assured that hostilities with Poland wouldn't put him at odds with the Soviet Union, he abandoned trying to reach a diplomatic negotiation or a peaceful settlement and attacked to solve what he called the Polish problem. Well, I want to describe all the background context of this, about German migration to the East. And those Germans who migrated east in the Middle Ages, what did they consider themselves? Did they consider themselves German? What did it even mean to be a German? Was this a question of bloodlines, whatever that meant in the Middle Ages? Was it a question of language? Was it a question of custom? Well, let's start off with the population movement, and then we'll get into questions of identity. There are many German-speaking populations in Central and Eastern Europe that's rooted in centuries of history that in some ways goes back to the settling in northeastern Europe of Germanic peoples that predates even the founding of the Roman Empire. The presence of independent German states in Prussia and later the German Empire and other multi-ethnic countries like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Poland and Imperial Russia shows the extent of German-speaking settlements. The German populations in these parts of Europe were referred to in German, in the German language, as Volksdeutsche, and there's still a substantial number of ethnic Germans in Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and Hungary, and Slovenia. The German settlement of Central and Eastern Europe occurred in the Middle Ages under a process called the Ostsiedlung, which literally means settling eastwards in German. It was the expansion of German culture and language and settlements to regions of northeastern and central and eastern Europe. These were lands that had been inhabited since the 6th century by Romanians and Hungarians and Slavs. The territory stretched from modern Estonia in the north to modern Slovenia in the south, a huge band along Central and Eastern Europe. There wasn't any sort of planned coordination, despite what any revisionist history, especially during the Nazi period, would say for this German movement. Most of it was just incidental. It was due to population growth in the High Middle Ages, thanks to revolutions in agriculture that I've talked about many times on this podcast, and the ability for medieval farmers to produce more crops and feed more people. This stimulated the movement of people from the Flemish and Saxon territories of the Holy Roman Empire eastward into the less populated Baltic region and Poland. The German nobility supported these movements, along with Slavic kings and dukes in the medieval church. Who wouldn't want uncultivated land to be cultivated and then it could be taxed? The settlement was peaceful, and sometimes it took place at the expense of the pagan Baltic peoples, the final holdouts in paganism in the Middle Ages. And the eastward German expansion accelerated along the Baltic with the Teutonic Order in the Middle Ages. The settlement process continued from the High Middle Ages to the 14th century with the Black Death, and afterwards, as Europe rebuilt itself, the most arable and promising regions were largely occupied. German settlement accelerated along the southeast coast of the Baltic Sea from the 13th to the 15th centuries when the crusading Teutonic Knights ruled Prussia through their monastic state. These areas centered around Danzig and Königsberg, which are one of the largest German settlements outside of the Holy Roman Empire, and they were only included in the German Empire of Otto von Bismarck in 1871 as East and West Prussia. So what do we make sense of this settlement? By the 19th century, German historians, and it was the Germans who really turned the study of history into a science, where the purpose wasn't simply to write a chronicle for a wealthy patron, but to critically examine old sources and base the writing of history on these sources. Historians like Leopold von Ranke, who relied on primary sources and an emphasis on narrative history and international politics for his writing. Well, because many of the academics who built the discipline of history were German, one of the big questions they had for themselves was how to understand Germany throughout history. What was the nation of Germany? Who were the German people? What lines of continuity connected a so-called German in the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1000 to a German in 1871? Trying to understand the German people in the 1800s and projecting this identity way back into the past is a process that historians of today love to deconstruct. Historians of today love to show how 100 years ago there were politicians and nationalists and other people who were creating these fictional identities of French or German or whatever nationality you want, and projecting it super far into the past and pretending there was a line of continuity, there was a Platonic German identity, a Platonic French identity.